Hello. Let's talk about England and the royalty at the time of Elizabeth. We'll come up to Elizabeth with her coronation, but let's just remember what has happened. Originally, Henry VIII had 3 children. The first of those children was Mary, and then the second was Elizabeth, and the third was Edward. Edward succeeded Henry VIII because males go before females in the children. Then, upon the death of Edward without an heir, then the next in line was the oldest daughter. That was Mary. She's called Bloody Mary because she tried to change England back to a Catholic country. She was unsuccessful. When she died after a very short reign, she was succeeded by Elizabeth. Elizabeth became queen at the age of 25. One of the things that I'd like to explore with Elizabeth is how she handled her problems. Let's talk then first about the problem of her acceptance. One of the difficulties is that Elizabeth was female, and the people of England remembered the female ruler just ahead of her, Bloody Mary, and they were angry. They did not want to have a reenactment of Bloody Mary's reign. Therefore, people were resentful of Elizabeth's female gender. One of the problems with Bloody Mary, to make things even worse, is that Bloody Mary had married Philip II of Spain and was dominated by him. People were worried that Elizabeth would marry, perhaps another strong ruler, and be dominated by him. Therefore, the female gender was a difficulty for Elizabeth. She never married, perhaps in part to ward off this apprehension of the people that she would be dominated by her husband. And instead of saying that she just didn't want to marry, she took a very creative approach and said, I am married to the people of England. They are my spouse, and I give my loyalty to them. It was a marvelous creative concept. The other problem that Elizabeth had immediately confronted was legitimacy. The Catholics in England, and there were still many Catholics, believed that she was illegitimate. They could not accept the divorce of Henry from Catherine of Aragon, and therefore Henry's subsequent marriage to anyone would have been illegal. And certainly it was illegal to Anne Boleyn, who was Elizabeth's mother. And therefore, if Henry was illegally married to Anne Boleyn, that would make Elizabeth a illegitimate daughter. In fact, some derisively called her the bastard queen. Take a look at this genealogy then. Henry VII was succeeded by Henry VIII. Henry VIII was succeeded in turn first by Edward VI, and then when Edward died, Lady Jane Grey came in for a few days, and then she was overthrown and eventually killed 1 month later by Mary I, who was Bloody Mary, who ruled for only a few years, and then Elizabeth succeeded. Well, Elizabeth never married, and so who was going to be her successor? She chose James I of Scotland, and that was a brave choice because James I's mother, Mary Queen of Scots, had an alternate claim to the throne beyond Elizabeth. And therefore, Elizabeth was brave enough to choose the daughter of her chief rival. Now, as we will talk about in a moment, Elizabeth had taken care of this chief rival by having her killed. On Coronation Day, Elizabeth wanted to win the support of the English people. Therefore, she staged an elaborate coronation march. She went through the city and she would come to an area where the people had gathered, and she would stop her carriage and she would talk to the people. And in those days, England had zones throughout the city where various professions were practiced. There would be an area for bakers and shoemakers and metal workers. So Elizabeth would stop at each of those, and she would invite the bakers to explain their trade, or the shoemakers and so on. And the people enjoyed the close interaction with their queen. They would hold up signs or have presents that they would give her. Oh, there's one particular example that is marvelous. Elizabeth was going down a street, and the people had arranged for a gift to be given to her by a small girl who was suspended from a crane. And as Elizabeth approached the small girl, the crane was lowered, and the little girl, dressed in white, looking like an angel, held the present. And she descended down like an angel from heaven and handed the present to Elizabeth. Elizabeth opened up the present and found that it was a Bible. Well, that would be wonderful for the Protestant that Elizabeth was. She grasped the Bible to her bosom, and she kissed the little girl on the forehead, and she then turned to the people and she said, "I will keep this Bible close to me for the rest of my life." And in fact, she did keep it on her bedstand for the rest of her life. But the people went crazy because they loved good Queen Bess. Another thing that she did was realize that she had some issues to deal with the nobility. Many of them resented her, either because of genealogy or because of her female gender, or perhaps they just wanted more power. Elizabeth did something marvelous, very, very creative. She would go on trips to visit the gentry. So she'd go to a lord's castle, and she would take her entire court with her, maybe 100 people. And they would live at the house, at the castle of this lord. The lord, of course, had to pay for everything. He had to be a good host. And then she would go with the lord and tour his region. And as they toured the region, Elizabeth would talk to the people, and she'd come up to them and say, "Isn't it wonderful that you're living here in England and you're under the auspice of this fine lord who I support?" And she would praise the people and praise the Lord. And when all of that was done, she cemented each of these lords to herself, and she pulled the people toward her by these visits, and the lords became subservient. They knew that the people supported Elizabeth, and there was really no way that they could give any significant dissension to Elizabeth's reign. She was brilliant. Not only that, these visits around England saved her a lot of money. And she had terrible financial problems when she came because there was a war going on, and she had to find some way to stop the war and to save the money that was being spent. This war was thrust upon England by Spain. Remember that Bloody Mary had married the King of Spain, Philip II. Philip wanted to fight the French, and he insisted that Mary declare war against the French. The people resented it, and lots of money was being spent in this war. So when Elizabeth came to power, she just simply stopped the war, and that saved a lot of money. But she did make an enemy of Philip II, but she had a way to get around that as well. In order to get money, Elizabeth promoted industry and trade. That was very clever because she knew that as industry and trade rose, there would be more taxes, and that would be more money for the crown. Elizabeth also invented a very interesting concept called privateers. She may not have invented it, but she certainly promoted it. One of the privateers would be a captain of a naval vessel, a man like, for instance, Francis Drake. Elizabeth told these captains that they could attack and take possession of ships from any country. Well, they were just pirates, but the difference between pirates and privateers is that these privateers had permission to do that from the crown of another country, in this case England, and they shared some of the profits with the crown. It is reported that 1 year, 80% of all of the gold and silver taken from the New World ended up in the hands of the privateers, who then gave the money to England, at least a portion. It was very beneficial for Elizabeth. Obviously, when she came to the throne, there was a conflict between Protestants and Catholics. Elizabeth decided that she would be a Protestant. She had to be a Protestant, because if she were a Catholic, then that would be declaring her own illegitimacy. So she had to be a Protestant, but she did not go after the Catholics. She just let the issue die, calmly, quietly tried to make the issue disappear. In Parliament, there were strong feelings, not only between Protestants and Catholics, but there were two factions within Protestantism, Church of England and Calvinism, and they were at war with each other. Elizabeth very, very cleverly asked Parliament to undo the problems that Mary had created by favoring Catholicism, and then she refused to favor any particular group, but she simply balanced the Protestants, the Puritans, that is the Calvinists, against the Church of England, against the Catholics. So she kept everybody balanced, and that gave her tremendous capability of doing what she needed. Well, when Elizabeth came to power, she had problems with France. As I mentioned, they were already at war. She just simply ended the war, and that relieved some of the pressure. But eventually she had some problems. The difficulty there was that the Queen of France was Mary, Queen of Scots. Remember that Mary, Queen of Scots is a pretender, or at least a co-claimant, to the throne of England. If Elizabeth were to be declared illegitimate, the Queen would become Mary, Queen of Scots. She would be simultaneously Queen of Scotland, Queen of France, and Queen of England. Elizabeth could not allow Mary, Queen of Scots, to have that kind of power. Elizabeth became lucky. Mary, Queen of Scots' French king husband died without any children. When that happened, Mary was not allowed to stay in France. The new king did not want her around. So Mary returned to her own country and became queen again. She had turned over the throne to her mother-in-law, who ran it during Mary's absence. And that brings us to the Scottish problem, and that problem was Scotland and Mary, Queen of Scots. Let's take a little background to understand what's happening in Scotland. Scotland had been independent since 1314. Prior to that, they had been a possession of England, but they were able to gain their independence. They were ruled by a family called the Stuarts. Mary, Queen of Scots, was one of the Stuart rulers. She had been subjected to what is called rough wooing under the period of Henry VIII. Henry wanted Mary, Queen of Scots, to marry his son Edward. He therefore sent an army into Scotland to force Mary, Queen of Scots, to wed his son. Mary was irate, and she therefore fled Scotland and went to France, where she was educated as a very young girl, and of course eventually married the King of France. When she did that, she was still quite young, so young in fact that when her husband died, they had had no children. As Mary was over in France, a rebellion in Scotland occurred against her mother-in-law, who was the acting queen. This rebellion was religious. The people of Scotland had become convinced that Calvinism was the appropriate religion. Mary, Queen of Scots, was a strong Catholic. Therefore, the people rebelled against Mary and against her mother-in-law, and they established a Protestant religion and made it the official Church of Scotland. It was Calvinist. When Mary returned from France, she was confronted with a Protestant parliament, and many of the lords were Protestant, and she was very uncomfortable. Nevertheless, she was the legitimate queen, and they allowed her to continue, and they encouraged her to remarry and therefore to have an heir, which she did. But she married a person who was not a good husband, not a strong supporter, and therefore she had a child by this man, a little boy who they named James, but this man was not a good person, and Mary fell out of love with him, if she ever did love him, and eventually Mary went into a conspiracy to have him killed. And the man that she was with in the conspiracy did in fact kill Mary's husband, and then in her foolishness she married the man who had killed her husband. The people in Scotland found out about it all, and they were irate. They forced Mary to leave, to abdicate the throne and to leave Scotland. Mary had no place to go. Therefore, she accepted the invitation of her cousin Elizabeth to come and stay in England. Elizabeth gave her sanctuary in a castle, and then Elizabeth saw to it that Mary never left the castle again. Mary continued to foment trouble for Elizabeth. She felt that she was the legitimate heir to the English throne. She tried to gain power, and eventually there was a conspiracy that was discovered. Elizabeth was convinced that she needed to write out a death warrant for Mary, but she didn't want to kill Mary. She didn't want to say, I killed my cousin. I killed a person who would have been queen had I been illegitimate. She thought that there were too many problems, and so Elizabeth signed the death warrant but set it aside, probably knowing that what happened would eventually happen. And what was that? One of her ministers came in, saw the death warrant, picked it up, and without it being given to him by Elizabeth, he took the death warrant and had it executed, and therefore Mary, Queen of Scots, was killed on the order of Elizabeth, but Elizabeth had not formally given the order, she had only signed it. When Mary, Queen of Scots, was forced to abdicate the throne and flee from Scotland, she was succeeded by her young son, James VI. He was raised as a Protestant and therefore became an acceptable replacement for Elizabeth when Elizabeth died. And that is exactly what happened. So James VI, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, was the successor to Elizabeth as the ruler of England. Elizabeth also had problems with the Spanish. One of the difficulties was that Spain was the biggest, most powerful country, but they resented the rise of England in trade. They were also highly resentful of the privateers, and they tried to put pressure on England in many, many ways. One of the most interesting of those was the pressure that they tried to apply through wooing. That is, the King of Spain, Philip II, attempted to woo and hopefully marry Elizabeth. He wanted to replace Bloody Mary, who was his wife, with Elizabeth. Elizabeth, of course, was not anxious to be the wife of Philip II, but she didn't tell Philip. She dangled him he would send ambassadors to ask Elizabeth to marry him, and Elizabeth would just put them off and talk to them, but never give an answer. So she, in essence, kept Philip waiting for a long, long time. Eventually, because of the problems of privateers and rivalry and disappointed wooing, Philip became very angry, and he decided that he was going to attack England. He assembled the largest naval group that had ever been assembled up to that time, and the Spanish Armada set sail for England. They were going to not only wipe out England, but then they were going to go to Holland, where there was a rebellion underway, and crush that rebellion and return the Dutch to power under the Spanish throne. They were already part of Spain, but they needed to suppress this rebellion. Well, the Armada came up, they encountered bad weather, there were a lot of other problems, and the privateers, especially Sir Francis Drake, was able to lead the English fleet against the Armada, and they destroyed the Armada. I was over on the west coast of Ireland, in the city of Galway, and there was a little cemetery near the hotel that I was staying in. I went over to the cemetery, and there was a plaque that said that the cemetery had been started to bury those who had died from shipwrecks from the Spanish Armada. What had actually happened is that the channel was so turbulent with bad weather and English ships that the Spanish Armada attempted to get over to Holland by going to the west, around the west coast of Ireland, around the northern part of Scotland, and eventually coming down the North Sea. Well, the weather was terrible and Spanish ships were destroyed over west of Ireland, and that's where these bodies came from. That's probably the point at which the Spanish kingdom begins its rapid decline. Well, Elizabeth had internal problems, and one of those things that she did to solve the lack of unity of the people was she gave them a vision. That vision was the glory of England. We call it the Elizabethan age because she was able to create a vision for the English people as a country of merchants, a country of artisans, a country full of literature and fine art, a country of trading, a country of diligent hard work. In other words, she created the England that later became the Great British Empire. She created a golden age during her own time. It was an age of prosperity and leisure, much, much better than they had previously known. Language and drama were especially important as the English people love the English language and consider it to be a key asset of their lives. Clearly, some of Elizabeth's problems were related to her gender. She had problems of acceptance in a male-dominated world, problems with the previous female ruler and issues of potential dominance by a husband, issues of succession. But here's the question. Do you think that her gender helped her overcome these problems, or was it a detriment? I think that Elizabeth's gender helped her overcome the problems. She used it to her advantage. She was clever in putting off Philip II, suspending his actions while he tried to woo her. She declared that the English people were her husband and the English nation was her spouse. It was a marvelous concept of using her female nature to her own advantage, and she was creative in doing it. We can ask ourselves, do we have leaders in modern times who are just as creative as Elizabeth? The answer is maybe, but certainly she set a standard that is very, very high for those who might come in the modern day. Thank you.